listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagal with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Should someone serving time for murder be allowed to undergo IVF to conceive a child? It sounds like an almost impossible set of circumstances, but it's exactly what's being debated in Australia right now. It raises a serious set of questions about the point of our prison system, the right to liberty, and the rights of a mother and a child.
To remove the right of a person to have a child or the right to family is a serious punishment in itself and amounts to sort of extra punishment other than that which is accorded by the court.
The first part of The Briefing's special two-part episode on whether murderer Alicia Schiller should have access to IVF in prison is coming up after all the day's news headlines with Chris Spiro on Friday, November 29.
Morning, Sasha. Morning, everybody. In a world first, Australia has passed into law a social media ban for kids. From the end of next year, children under 16 years of age will be banned from accessing platforms including Instagram, TikTok, Facebook and Snapchat in a bid to protect them from harm online and improve their mental health and well-being. On a day that Labor was trying to ram through 37 bills, the Senate voted in favour of the ban, with the coalition giving bipartisan support. But the Greens were among those to vote against it. Senator Sarah Hanson-Young outspoken in her disapproval.
Trying to fool the Australian population that they are doing this in the interests of children is abhorrent. They're not. This is a political fix, not a social media fix. The ban is rubbish.
Yeah, Senator Hanson-Young has been very outspoken in the lead up to this. She was part of a Snap Senate inquiry this week, which heard mixed reviews of banning kids from socials. Some mental health experts suggested measures like adjusting algorithms and increasing education would be more effective than just saying you can't go on until you're 16. Social media platforms now have 12 months to figure out how to enforce this ban. An age verification trial is not due to wrap up until well into 2025. Meantime, a handshake between Labor and the Greens has seen 20 more bills make it through the Senate on a chaotic final day of sitting, and there was plenty of criticism of this move by Labor to try and ram through all of this legislation.
I was not voted in this place to give you a free pass to put through 40 bills in one day.
What Jackie said. Because honestly,
I don't accept that we are trying to circumvent scrutiny or accountability.
So that was independent Jackie Lambie and the coalition's Simon Birmingham and Bridget Archer all speaking there. Nevertheless, 31 bills all up passed, including migration laws, future Made in Australia legislation, build to rent, new doxing laws, as well as anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism bills, just to name a few, Chris.
Yeah, that is a lot. And look, the Prime Minister will be chalking this up as a win, but he's now facing increased questions about when we will head to the polls next year. On ABC's 7:30 last night, Anthony Albanese all but confirmed there'd be no summer announcement.
I don't give election dates or variations to the question.
That's not confirming the election date, that's confirming a sitting in February or not.
We fully expect to be sitting in February, and we'll continue to do the two objectives, everything aimed at how do we make life better for Australians.
So essentially, he is saying that Parliament will sit early in 2025. That rules out a late summer or early spring election, Sash. But you probably noticed there the political spin, so don't be fooled. The unofficial campaign for the 2025 election is well and truly underway.
Yes, and now just quickly before we move on, I mentioned Simon Birmingham earlier in the script. Yesterday, he shocked Parliament by announcing his retirement. He's considered one of the last remaining moderate Liberals. He served in multiple coalition governments and was among those who supported the gay marriage bill, which he talked up in his valedictory speech as, you know, one of the things he's really proud of. Also yesterday, Lydia Thorpe did something in Parliament that hasn't been done since 1971. So she was banned from the floor of the Senate yesterday after getting into a stoush with Pauline Hanson. So what she did yesterday, when she couldn't sit on the floor of the Senate, she joined the press gallery, usually reserved for journos and interested members of the public, of which there are a few who want to sit in on this sort of stuff. So she went and sat in the press gallery to interrupt the upper house, yelling about freeing Palestine before being escorted out.
Free Palestine!
I call the clerk.
Palestine will be free!
Yeah, so that draws the 2024 parliamentary year to a close.
Oh, round of applause, everyone. We made it. Over now to the Middle East. Israel's military has overnight carried out fresh airstrikes in southern Lebanon, less than 2 days into its ceasefire with Hezbollah. The IDF says it was attacking a Hezbollah facility that was operating in violation of their deal. Israeli tanks also fired 6 areas within 2 kilometres of the border it has declared off limits, with Hezbollah officials accusing Tel Aviv of attacking Lebanese people trying to return to their homes.
So the ceasefire sets out an initial 60-day period for Israeli troops and Hezbollah to pull out of those areas and for the Lebanese army and a UN peacekeeping force to move in. The IDF says its forces will be withdrawn slowly and it's reserving its rights to strike if the militant group violates the terms of the truce. And Israel is advising its 60,000 displaced residents not to return home just yet, while a Lebanese army source has said its forces are conducting patrols and setting up checkpoints in the country's south along that border.
And it's the time of the year where we reflect on what was and start looking to the future. So social analysts at McCrindle have done exactly that, announcing what they think the top 5 trends of 2025 will be. So, number 1. Next year will be the year of the big build, with Australia tipped to enter a milestone period in infrastructure development, with the issue becoming critical. Number 2, Sash, we'll see a rise in grappling with our productivity and individual desires. What they mean by that is that businesses will struggle with needing a productive workforce that wants to prioritise work-life balance and individual career goals, something we've seen increasingly since the pandemic, if I'm being honest.
Well, yeah, think about silent quitting. That was such a thing a couple of years ago. Look, third, McCrindle expects to see more of us choose cheaper options over our desire to be socially responsible, and that's all down to the cost of living and inflation, which is, disappointing, but it's a fact of life at the moment. You want to buy the free-range chicken, but, the one that's not free-range is $3-4 cheaper, so it does make a difference. Number 4 is a prediction that we'll see a rise in digital detoxes in 2025. The researchers there say we're becoming more sceptical and less optimistic about technology and how it impacts our lives, which I think is a really interesting point. And finally, Chris, 2025 is predicted to be a milestone year for the generations. Now, get this, it'll be the first time that 7 will all be alive at the same time. So that's from the silent generation at the very top down to the new babies of Generation Beta who will start being born next year.
Yeah, I know that naturally thinking about generations and the way that they name it, Generation Alpha, after Alpha comes Beta, it's a natural thought to have. It never dawned on me that the generation coming next is going to be called Generation Beta. It sounds so weird to me.
Well, that's my baby. My baby's going to be Gen Beta. But I thought my baby was going to be Gen Alpha because in my head, Gen Alpha's only a few years old. Do you know the oldest Gen Alpha is turning 15 next year and they're entering the workforce? See, I think we think of it from boomers to millennials, and now we're kind of Gen Z is obviously more and more being included when we. Oh yeah, sorry. And I'm just starting to get used to Gen Alpha, and now Gen Beta's coming along. Some really interesting predictions from McCrindle there. But yes, let's enjoy our slow descent into the end of the year. We got Christmas and New Year to get through first.
Bring it on.
Chris, thanks so much for being here for the headlines. Next up is our deep dive, and it is a 2-part series looking at whether we should allow prisoners in Australia to be able to go and get IVF.
Hey, Bension here. Alicia Schiller is a convicted murderer. She stabbed her roommate to death in 2014, and she's currently serving a 16-year sentence in a maximum security prison in Victoria. Schiller has also been given permission to leave jail for IVF treatment. If she gets pregnant, it's being reported that she plans to raise the child with her in prison for the first 5 years, then hand the child over to her parents while she serves what's left of her sentence. Relatives of Schiller's victim have expressed shock, arguing that even if Schiller has the legal right to IVF, it's just wrong, and the law should be changed to prevent it. Victorian Liberal MP Brad Batten argues that convicted murderers do not deserve freedom to have a child. He makes that case forcefully in part 2 of this episode, which is dropping into your feed right now. We encourage you to take a listen to part 2 after this. But if we prevent someone having a child in prison, what kind of precedent does that set? Does the state really want to get involved in deciding who does and does not deserve to have children? And ultimately, is the opportunity to have children, whether in prison or not, a fundamental human right? In part one of this special two-part episode, you will hear from Greg Barnes. He's an Australian barrister and criminal justice spokesman with the Australian Lawyers Alliance. Greg, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing. Why should someone convicted of murder be allowed to undergo IVF in prison?
Well, look, every prisoner is in the same position. That is that the punishment is the deprivation of liberty. Once they're in prison, they should be allowed to access the health system in the way that any member of the community can. And that includes the right to have a child and the right to give birth while they're in prison.
If this person does successfully fall pregnant, how can they provide adequate care for their child while they're serving in a maximum security prison?
Well, that depends on the prison making sure that that particular prisoner, any prisoner in that particular position, is given support and a nurturing environment. It's not unusual for women to give birth while they're in prison. I think the global figure is around 10% of women prisoners are pregnant when they enter the prison system. You do have to make sure, and the more humane prisons are doing this, to make sure that there are mother-baby units and that there are other facilities so that the child can bond with the mother, and making sure that they're in an environment where they can nurture that child in the early years. And, that has improved over the years.
But is prison ever really the right place for a child? Is there an argument that they would be better off in out-of-home care?
Well, I'm not a child psychologist and not a specialist in child home care, so make that clear. But certainly there is evidence to suggest, and I chair a prisoners' legal service in Tasmania, and there's evidence to suggest that the previous system of removing the child immediately after the mother, who's a prisoner, gives birth has had terrible impacts on both. And there is plenty of evidence around that suggests that in terms of the small child and the mother, that this is a much better environment for both of them in the long term.
What does the law say about the right to access IVF for a prisoner?
Well, look, the law, and there is precedent in Victoria in relation to the ability to access IVF. Certainly international law and the law in a number of countries says that there is no impediment because, particularly countries that have human rights legislation, there is a right to family, and that includes right to have a child. And so there are also international standards relating to the issue, including what are called the Mandela Rules, named after Nelson Mandela, which deal with prisoners, and there are a range of other rules. I think the Bangkok Rules, for example, deal with mothers in prison. So, there are quite a number of rules that deal with this particular space.
Would it be the taxpayer that pays for this treatment?
Well, that depends. In many, many circumstances, it's private. I know in some jurisdictions, I think Ireland, I'm right in saying that there is now public access, in other words, what's equivalent to the Medicare system. But in many jurisdictions, it's on a private basis.
If prison is at least partly about punishment and certainly about removing liberties, in this case, if someone is in prison for 16 years for stabbing someone to death, is there an argument that part of that punishment is that you can't have children?
No. I mean, that's morally wrong, and it's never been part of the prison jurisprudence, if you like, or law over many, many years. The idea of prison is that you are depriving a person of a fundamental right. That is the right to liberty. And the right to liberty means freedom of movement. That is freedom to move around the community. You do not give up other rights, and that's the way it should be, because it is more than adequate punishment to deprive a person of that capacity to have freedom of movement each day.
You do lose a lot of liberties by going to prison. You can't work, you can't engage with members of the public.
The deprivation of liberty inevitably, as you rightly say, involves, you can't go out to work and come back every day. Mind you, there are plenty of programs in prison that do allow that, but they're prison sanctioned. And of course you have limits on freedom of association, but that's part of the deprivation of liberty. It's pretty hard to argue that removing a right to have a child or the right to medical treatment should be part of the deprivation of liberty, because they're completely different. And in fact, to remove the right of a person to have a child or the right to family is a serious punishment in itself and amounts to sort of extra punishment other than that which is accorded by the court.
But this person killed someone. Isn't serious punishment exactly what is required?
She's got serious punishment. She's gone to jail for a long period of time. That's the punishment. I mean, it's interesting, the culture in Australia, like the US and like the UK, thinks that we have to have a very punitive approach to prisoners. If you go to Northern Europe, we wouldn't be having this debate. And they have lower recidivism rates. They jail less people and they have lower recidivism rates. In other words, they have lower rates of people reoffending. But we're addicted to a treat 'em mean policy, and it has terrible consequences in the community, not only for the prisoner themselves, but also their families.
This has obviously been fiercely opposed by some politicians in Victoria, including Liberal MP Brad Batten. What do you think of his argument that convicted murderers don't deserve the freedom to have a child?
Oh, it's absurd. I mean, what is he suggesting? That once prisoners are on parole, we should be monitoring who they sleep with or, what treatment they get so that they don't get pregnant? I mean, it's just a ridiculous argument. And, sadly, Mr. Batten, like a lot of politicians, seeks to make political capital out of what is a complex moral and legal issue.
Is there a legal outline of what the rights of a child are in this sort of situation?
Yeah, there are, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child and other rights, essentially they say best interests of the child. Now, it's not the case that in every case where a woman gives birth in prison, that child remains with the mother. It's generally the case, as I understand it, because that is in the best interest of the child. But it's not in every case. And so the best interest of the child comes first, and there's an assessment made by experts about whether or not that best interest is served by being with the mother, even in a prison environment.
There might be some people listening who find it very hard to hear this story and this argument, and they may say, well, I understand the legal precedent, I understand the philosophical debate on an intellectual level, but still this feels morally reprehensible in some kind of way. What would you say to a person who feels that way right now?
I can understand why they feel that way, but I would respectfully say that they're wrong, because what they're really saying is that a person should be deprived of a right to family and that should be a part of a prison sentence. Well, it's not. I mean, if we're going to start doing that, you would say, well, we don't think you're suitable to have a child, so you can't have treatment, or, you've come into prison and you're pregnant and we don't think you should have a child. I mean, it would have really disturbing consequences.
Greg Barnes, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Bension.
Barrister Greg Barnes there. And as we mentioned, this is part one of a special two-part episode of The Briefing. In your feed right now is part two with Victorian Liberal MP Brad Batten, who argues strongly that Alicia Schiller does not deserve to have a child in prison. Go listen to that now. Meanwhile, please do share this episode with someone you think might be interested to hear it. And as always, you can find us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on YouTube and TikTok at Listener Newsroom. Till next time, I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you then.
Listener.